Hello. Good morning, almost afternoon. I want to extend a welcome. I'm Dave Perkins with the Religion and the Arts program. Thank you for being here today. Bruce Morrill holds the Edward A. Mallory Chair of Catholic Studies here at Vanderbilt Divinity School, where he serves as Professor of Theological Studies. In addition to 8 books on liturgy, sacraments, and ritual, his dozens of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters include such titles as Music, Liturgy, and Religious Formation in the International Theological Review Concilium, Liturgical Music, Bodies Proclaiming and Responding to the Word of God in the ecumenical journal Worship, and also A Pastoral Role for Music, Sacramental and Salvific Powers in the recently published volume Music, Theology, and Justice. Bruce has held several visiting chairs and fellowships across the United States and Europe, and was recently elected Vice President of the North American Academy of Liturgy. A Roman Catholic priest and member of the Jesuit order, Bruce presides and preaches regularly at Christ the King Church and Riverbend Maximum Security Institute. During his long Jesuit formation, he became a liturgical musician. An avocation he developed by earning course credits in organ at Columbia University, where he was doing a master's degree in cultural anthropology. And along with that, Bruce pursued his music interests in a study program with the Boston Conservatory. Bruce has entitled his talk for us this morning, Rituals Musicality, Music as Innate to Bodies at Worship. Please welcome with me, if you will, Dr. Bruce Morrill.
Grateful to Dave for that gracious introduction and also the invitation to speak for this program we have in Religion and the Arts in Contemporary Culture. I'm in my 7th year on the faculty here, and it's delightful to be so invited for the first time. I would like to begin by reading out the description that most likely attracted you here to this talk, or maybe it was just the title, but I would like it to be a guiding thesis, which I can then exploit. Whereas people widely recognize from experience that music enlivens Christian liturgy and other types of corporate worship, explaining scientifically and theologically why that is the case has proven a difficult but increasingly rewarding challenge. And so I wish to review some key findings about bodily effects as opposed to simply attending to text and language in ritual music and song, as well as silence, as all of these have proven constitutive of the shared human action we call divine worship. I do my work, as Dave's gracious invitation would indicate, as a theologian. And as a Christian theologian, that's the framework of the talk, and specifically as a sacramental liturgical theologian. And so the work of a theologian, if to be done well, must most fundamentally be asking the question, what's going on? That may sound very blunt and simple, but it can't be assumed, right? Theology had, moving well into the second half of the 20th century, remained an academic matter wedded tightly to philosophy, but with the recognition that theology only exists, Christian theology only exists, if Christians are doing Christianity, opened up the recognition further that other tools are needed, those from the social sciences, and one can never learn enough history. History, and more history. So all of these feed into the way we do and work on theology, but a fortiori all the more, it's crucial to the work of someone whose focus or specialty is sacraments and liturgy. Crucial to this question of liturgical music, or to put it more broadly, a broader Christian context, worship music, is the body. And so I must lay out first a theoretical framework. I'd like to do that with you. A theoretical framework for analyzing the complex elusive phenomenon of the body, and this in relation, therefore, to music making, music hearing, music sounding. But lest this get too dry in theory, I'll also try to pepper it with some analysis and examples and even anecdotes. Key concepts to keep track of as I give this talk it's to a general audience. I hope you'll find it accessible, if not enjoyable. But key concepts to keep track of would include intention, vestibular apparatus, the ear system, silence, listening versus hearing. Those will be concepts that come up in the middle part of the talk. But the first part concerns bodies of worship. Remember the subtitle of the talk, Rituals, Musicality, the title, Music is innate to bodies of worship, or bodies at worship. What is the worshiping body, or the body at worship? The temptation in modernity, and what I'm doing here is beginning, as students, a couple of them in the room would know who've had me before, it's best to lay out what one's arguing against. This is usually what motivates what one's arguing for. So the temptation in modernity is to think, when we say body, or bodies of worship, to think only in terms of physical and individual bodies, bodiliness or body, corporality, being a matter of the soma, the physical body. And with that, the body and the rhetoric of our time, the body's boundaries, to think in modernity, body is also to think individuality. And this has become, it seems to me, in the last couple of years, in the years since I've been here, like I say, it's my 7th year here, this physicality and individuality, perhaps agency, all of these being modern, not only concepts, but values, has been heightened. Or these have been heightened by social and cultural events, and indeed great problems, including those which have generated the Black Lives Matter movement, or as well, in the last year or so, concern for sexual violence and all the attendant assaults and injustices therein. So we can think of the body certainly as physical, but you'll see what I've already started to describe is that the body also is social. And furthermore, we'll see a third category is the body is traditional. So for one to do theology well and attend to what is going on, and for one to do this with regard to sacraments and liturgy, requires an attending to the body, but a recognition, as it were more sophisticated, holistic recognition of, in an American sort of term, bodiliness, though I've found that still hasn't made its way into dictionaries, corporality or corporeality. This has been an advance in my field of sacramental and liturgical theologies, which discipline had, from its inception in the latter part of the 19th century, for about 100 years, into the 1970s or 80s or so, been largely text-bound. The scholarship being historical, philological, archaeological eventually, but heavily text-bound, with the basic theoretical and category mistake of thinking that if one studied written texts, one had accessed historically, what liturgies, rituals, and other acts of worship had been. Now that's to the advantage of anyone who wishes to arrive at normative claims, and that is to say, to control or to use the scholarship to advance some actual, as it were, pastoral or other agenda. And certainly theology only really earns its keep as a discipline if it precisely always has a practical and pastoral intent. But that being the case, all the more we have to do what the eminent Jewish liturgical scholar and theologian Lawrence Hoffman advanced in a book in the late 1980s entitled Beyond the Text. We have to work much more, and have been, some of us at least, with the hard and challenging realities of the context in which texts function. Indeed, it's the reason, as David mentioned in the kind introduction, I myself did a degree in cultural anthropology, an MA in cultural anthropology at Columbia some years before going on and doing a PhD in theological studies, constructive theology at Emory. Why? With a view to this specialization in sacraments and liturgy, invaluable would be the tools of cultural anthropology. So, control, or lack of control. We think of bodies, and that's often, in our own time, a question or a problem that we associate with bodiliness. Now, I've already mentioned the categories of the physical, individual, social, and traditional in relation to body. And in so doing, I am directly drawing from the work of a most eminent sacramental liturgical theologian, the French scholar Louis-Marie Chauvet. He retired 10 years ago this coming June at the Institut Catholique. Great system in France. You can retire at 65, and all the benefits and assurances are in place that one can do that. Chauvet, who continues now as pastor of a parish in the suburbs of Paris, that is to say with people that are quite socially marginalized, was a prodigious writer, and largely, as is not unusual in his context, of pointedly specific essays and articles, especially in La Maison Dieu, a journal that is theological and pastoral, but again, only in the American context, it seems to me at this point, would I be having to make apologies for that, especially with regard to the topic of sacraments and liturgy. But he also produced, as his habilitation back in the 1980s, a magnum opus called Symbol and Sacrament, a sacramental reinterpretation of Christian existence. And in that text, which proved controversial at the time, at least in his own church location, in that text, he basically builds out of or pursues the recognition of the bodiliness of the practice of the faith, and therefore the fundamental reality of how humans only exist symbolically. Got him in trouble because, if you might remember a word I mentioned about 3 or 4 minutes ago, because of issues of control. The book, among other things, takes and swings an axe at the very roots of the big, massive tree in my own church, Roman Catholic Church, takes an axe to clericalism. So we're going to look at, I'm just saying, once one really starts to interrogate the bodily reality of sacraments and liturgy and worship, these questions of power, authority, and control are necessarily, inevitably in play. Okay, so just my little ode to Chauvet. Let's look quickly at his helpful analysis, how he breaks down into, understandable categories what, of course, we know only exists synthetically, that is to say, as one ongoing activity or process. Break it down into parts. And so he says the body is a, of course, this is the English translation, the body is a triple body. The body is at once physical, cultural and traditional. And I'd like to just briefly rehearse those points and start to introduce some observations in our own context and time. Well, the physical is obvious. In fact, it's how I began 10 minutes ago, noting that for many people, it may be indeed where their thought stops initially. But it's helpful to recognize with Chauvet that the physicality of our bodies is, we often refer to it as natural. That might be a cognate for many of us at times. The natural body is the physical body, but also that the body is cosmic. And in this, what does he mean by this? In this sense, that our bodies are never even in isolation from the rest of the physical cosmos in which we live. And in fact, we are affected by and we affect this cosmic, natural, we would use the language that's anthropocentric environment. So the body's physical, it's cosmic, it's natural. And I'll circle back to that since I'm arguing the most obvious after I work a bit more with these other two aspects of bodiliness. And in really reverse order from what Chauvet does, I'd like to secondly speak to the traditional. Because the notion of a traditional body, think now of an assembly, right? In fact, ecclesia, just to remind ourselves or inform ourselves, ecclesia in Greek, and it's simply directly translated likewise in Latin, the word we translate as church means a drawing together, an assembling. So remember then, we think of a body of an assembly, the assembled body, don't we? And this language is used in civic societies as well as by our Western categories, religious and so forth. So the traditional body might, for the sake of argument and lecture, be most associated with a concept like church. When one thinks church, one thinks tradition. In fact, when we think about the very modernity that we inhabit, that traditional identity, or the church identified as traditional body, is precisely what was shoved aside so that men could arrive at clear, autonomous thought and knowledge without the tyranny of tradition. Right? That's just a quick shorthand about the philosophical aspects or the philosophical arena of enlightenment, the Enlightenment. So church, definitely, any church, a traditional body. But reformers, and it's always true within traditions, traditions are constantly, historically, undergoing reforms and changes. And the tricky thing about the traditional body, the way I like to phrase it myself, when we get at what do you mean by tradition, I've come to observe over decades that tradition basically concerns the phrase, thus has it always been. So I'm trying to move this concept out in a very broad way so it can be of use across different types of social and institutional bodies. Thus has it always been. This can happen, I would describe it, for example, in my own experience of many, many years, decades now, living and trying to provide pastoral service to Yupik Eskimos in southwest Alaska on the Bering Sea coast and western sea coast of Alaska. And when I was there first, right out of college, as a lay volunteer for a year, was invited into, in that village, their own traditional dancing, which the elders and other generations prepared from Thanksgiving through Easter. Notice how calendars, traditions are overlapping, right? But which is to say winter, which by November back then was already a good 6 to 8 weeks underway. That what I could observe over that year, even before I'd gone off and done my anthropology degree, was how much there had been change and adaptation to dance for them, that they knew, and some would consciously or explicitly speak about this, that it would only perdure in the ever-changing circumstances of their people. At that point in 1981-82, there was telecommunication, that there was one TV station that was transmitted out there to the western coast, imagine. Telephones, you know, so this is 1981. But they could realize a rapidly changing world, and the elders realized if this is going to perdure, then constant little adjustments and changes are going to have to happen. And yet it's traditional. And the key thing in that, I found, was that one doesn't talk about, in most cultural situations, one doesn't talk about those changes, right? They happen. Or it might be that there's controversy and fighting, and very often very interpersonal fighting, a couple of strong personalities who get ticked off, and you know, there's a whole drama around that, which could also be a technical term of Victor Turner, a drama, which would be forgotten a few years later, because however it's resolved that there's some adjustment in the way this form of dance and the ritual presentation of that dance takes place is forgotten relatively quickly in oral cultures, oral and oral cultures, cultures that don't have a written language, which is true of the Yupiks. So you see, it wouldn't take but a couple years before thus is how we've always done it. You see? And that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'd like to give you a charming, what I hope, anecdote. Myself, I celebrated back in this 2017 in June, specific date, but then in my province, a general celebration. I was at that point 25 years ordained as a Roman Catholic priest, 35 years a Jesuit. But I reached back through my experience in teaching undergrads at Boston College for 15 years, a memory that really still makes me smile with a lot of affection and gratitude, but of young people in the early 2000s telling me that they weren't so into traditional church music, and by that they meant the stuff that the St. Louis Jesuits wrote in the 1970s. And other such figures as Rory Cooney and a whole range of contemporary, what people of my generation, us old boomers, would call contemporary church music, and which has been delightfully ecumenical. But to these young people already, if they grew up their whole life hearing songs like "Though the Mountains May Fall" or "Here I Am, Lord," that's traditional music. And what they were pushing for was, can't we do some stuff with metal or, you know, pick some other genre? So how deep or how far is a tradition? You see what I'm saying? And if you wonder about this, in relation again to the topic of body, it's simply to recognize that bodies also are sites of constant change. Social bodies, traditional bodies, individual or physical bodies are all sites of change, but also of contestation, of contested, or it has to be negotiated or even at times fought over. Music plays no small role then in the perduring of traditions, certainly religious traditions, and as a Christian theologian, Christian traditions, right? And so one would find to this day, if one goes to many Orthodox churches, if they are from Central, Carpathian, or Russian backgrounds, Slavonic chant, right? With its own, actually its own vocabulary. It's quite unique, isn't it? And we could give other examples as well. But bodies are also social and cultural. And by this is meant, Chauvet and myself would mean something much broader than the traditional. In fact, the traditional really is a subset of the social cultural, but I preferred to take it in this reverse order. The social body, the cultural body, is economic, political, familial, even religious, by our Western way of breaking these things down. And yet, all of those social ways of living may bear within them traditions. But the changing circumstances of a given social body or cultural body shape and affect those traditions and vice versa. And it's just, I'm saying, I hope you find this helpful. I'm saying all of this to you depending on your own interests and your own backgrounds and where you've come from today and where you're going back. If these ways of breaking down the body might be helpful to analyze what's going on pastorally or in other circumstances in your own locations. The physical, the traditional, and the social. The social body, of course, in flux and in change, is always in need of order, is it not? And again, there is, as great anthropologists like Victor Turner analyzed, there are great dramatic cycles of breakings of order and reestablishment of order as well. And we live currently, in our own context, in a time of such great change. But all of this circles back to the what and the why of worship at all. And that comes finally to how Chauvet pulls this all together in what he calls the I body, the letter I as in the first person nominative pronoun. The I body, or the person body, that each person, Chauvet says, is. Every individual person, he doesn't want to say has a body, and I so thoroughly agree with him. So that's a dualistic notion that riddles and plagues modernity. Because if we say that there's me, and I have a body, if we somehow articulate our existence this way, you're already giving a priority somehow to this disembodied I over against the body. Does that make sense? So rather, it's better just to simply have this clumsy neologism, the I-body, or the person-body. Because each one of us, in our bodily existence, creates our own range of priorities and how we integrate our physicality, our sociality, and our traditional engagements and locations. Certainly in our own context presently here, in the U.S., in the roughly early 20th century, the individual is highly prioritized. But that itself is a social reality and a social question, and is bumped up against, as we know, all of the traditional bodies of Christian churches. But it also is extremely important with regard to music. So, to move to the next step of the talk, which will touch a bit in very untechnical language, the scientific or therapeutic dimensions of music in the body, I just wish to pull it together first and summarize that rituals themselves, in this case Christians in the way they worship, do their Sunday or other worship, or in many of the churches their liturgies, that worship itself is one of the key ways, fundamental ways in which a church exists at all. And even in churches that say we are not a high church or we're not a liturgical church, we worship, it wouldn't take much effort on the part of any of us, amateur even anthropologists, to recognize ritual patterns of behavior. Just watch out for what people don't want changed. And you've got right at what is traditional, what is symbolic, and what is symbolic ritual, right? That's exactly where you'll find it. And I'd said I'd circle back to the physical body, and watch out also, as we know too well, that whenever people immediately argue for what is just natural, it invariably is not, right? Natural becomes, at least in English, that functions, or in American culture, natural can function practically as an adjective that is referring to traditional. That's just the way it is, or thus has it always been, right? Okay. But if we move off of those notions of natural and with regard to the physical body and take a brief survey of work that's been done with regard to why music is so intrinsic to forming and sustaining a social, let alone traditional body, we turn to the remarkable work in the second half of the 20th century in neurophysiology. Now, I'm not a scientist, but to do a degree in anthropology included units in physical anthropology, or what's called biological anthropology, so I'm making my little excuses in an academic site or academic building. But again, I'm not going to bog down in that. I just want to deliver how this is pertinent to the work of sacramental and liturgical theologians in service of the pastoral and practical life of the church. We take a figure like a neurophysiologist, an important one actually to look at briefly, by the name of Alfred Tomati. He was a Frenchman born in 1920, died in 2001, whose career became increasingly controversial, which I can speak to briefly as I move along. But his work was precisely as a specialist in ear, nose, and throat who grew up in a family, his parents, who were very heavily engaged professionally in the operatic world of Paris as singers and producers. But he developed, interestingly, as a physician of this and then as a scientific researcher and specialist. Pushing what? Helping people to see and to understand, of course see is a metaphor, to understand both not only the auditory but the vestibular functions of the human ear. Okay? We live in a culture so often that will think in terms of the visual, in terms of what conveys or communicates, I would argue. But in fact, of course, our human existence is driven, is supported and functions, it is, as Tomatis pursued this in his own work so brilliantly, it is really delivered through the aural and the oral as much as the visual. And this is true even of people who have hearing impairment, etc., if one digs into his and many other neurophysiologists' work. Why? And this is work, I should just note, for which he himself garnered more than six public health, scientific, and even arts and sciences honors and awards in his lifetime. Well, how? What are we talking about? The auditory and the vestibular, that is to say, even the vertical and the horizontal, the listening and the hearing. Research came to find that in the human fetus, the ear is one of the organs that most immediately starts developing. And in fact, it led Tomatis to eventually, and his colleagues, both not only in Europe but around the globe, to speak in terms of we shouldn't think of human skin, for example, we shouldn't think of the ear as some kind of differentiated example of human skin, but rather skin as a differentiated form of ear. And this is because of how, not only from that nascent fetal development, but how the ear functions, obviously, in terms of our vestibular system in our body, right? So it's all the inner ear, the middle ear, that enables us to have verticality at all, balance, a whole series of these functions that we have. There's a charming story, I think it is anyway, so you have to listen to it, that comes from Tomatis' work in the late 60s, early 70s, 1960s, early 70s, with regard to music and Christian tradition, in that he was called in by the abbot of a Benedictine monastery in France, where the majority of the monks had become listless and chronically ill. And what he discovered quickly by interviewing, so could you keep it, I've got to watch my time, but start thinking, right? Traditional body, social body, physical body. Yep. So we're already in the game, right? Benedictine monastery. But the abbot had interpreted the reforming and renewing Second Vatican Council of the 1960s to mean that in his abbey they should dump the seven occasions around the clock when they would chant together. This is a waste of time. It's very late 60s also. This is a waste of time, right? We could do more practical stuff with those 7 waking hours a day, that kind of thing, okay? Very utilitarian. And very out of touch with the body, one might say. And what he found was that 2/3 of the men really were in pretty tough shape, and most had no motivation anymore. They're just kind of listlessly, slumped around. And what he did, and to make matters worse, their own medical doctors decided the problem was the fact that they were vegetarians. And so he ordered them to eat meat for protein. And of course, this just upset their bodily systems, especially men that were, you know, mature and older. So what he did, first of all, he told them how to start chanting again. He drove them right back into their choir stalls. Get back to your diet. You know, go back to all these traditional things that you thought were expendable. And a characteristic I want to note about modernity is how moderns will so quickly change and explicitly change traditions. In the way I was trying to give an example 15 minutes ago of how pre-industrial, if you will, or other types of cultures don't do things that way. In any event, it became for him a remarkable laboratory, this monastery experience, to support and actually encourage his research into this total bodily effect of the voice in relation to the ear and the vestibular system, and then all the organs of the body, right? Because, of course, all we do, just to, again, for me to give this homely account of some of the scientific information, of course, our bodies are constantly vibrating, and there's no such thing, per se, there's no such thing as the specific sounds that we each produce, or each of our own eye bodies produce, our person bodies, right? And in fact, the way in which our bodies then function to make the sounds that we would call either tunes or voices or scales of sound and so forth are precisely affecting us in the body's entirety, right? A lot of his research and his associates, and it's not restricted simply to him, but the research of neurophysiology then also moved into, and what he focused on himself, was the effect of the voice in relation to the ear and their integral relationship itself. Where things got controversial, just to give a quick footnote about Tomatis, in his later years, right up through when he died in 2001, was he was pressing from this to look more and more into cases like, how would this then help people who are autistic? Or how would this help people with a whole range of other afflictions that were evasive to treatment, effective treatment by what we might call modern medicine? That work, as it were, had him pushed into what was called homeopathic or non-scientific work, non-modern scientific work, by the judgments of the modern academy. But this other work that I described, the earlier work, as much as he was able to document it and work it out, itself was groundbreaking and widely rewarded work. So here's the point from him, and all these this field, that particular field of neurophysiology, is that we cannot be surprised then that sound of all types and silence, as these are framed and performed through music, are so essential to and irreducible in an assembled body of people at worship, right? And it's important then, or I think it's valuable, it's proven, at least in my experience over the last 15 years since I started reading and studying some of this, this kind of information can be very helpful when we try to figure out what's going on. What's going on in a given church? Why would there be an attractiveness or a repulsiveness about a particular experience of a body at worship, a particular church that one might belong to or visit? Well, one could start to analyze in terms of, well, social location, mine in relation to this place, tradition, what's going on in my own sounding of my own body in this place. Here are a few points to be drawn. Good. And then we can go to some questions and discussion. I'm hoping this will spark your interest. What will we say then about these bodies at worship? First of all, the very posture of standing. One can read in in we can call it patristic literature, or early Christian literature, explicit teaching by figures such as the Cappadocians, Basil, for example, Basil of Caesarea or Basil the Great, explanations in homilies or other teaching, catechetical teaching, for why the posture of standing is the only viable posture for the body at worship, the church body at worship. And he relates it to the Lord's Day, the liturgy of the Lord's Day, Sunday, as the day of the resurrection. Okay? But one can reach back into, of course, the stories pointedly in Matthew and Luke, healing stories, where the very verbs in Greek that Jesus uses, that Jesus is recounted as using when he's healing people, as being the same verbs that appear in the resurrection passages about, little girl, stand up, arise, things like that. Or when someone on the roadside, like I think it was Zacchaeus climbed the tree, but blind Bartimaeus, the guy in the ditch. Well, one of the things that's salvific is precisely when the people are changed by Jesus and say, get up. He's calling you. Okay? So anyway, there's a long, I'm saying there's a long traditional value given to this arising or standing, but also across all cultures and times we see, and we know it ourselves, even in our very fragmented late modern American culture, in all sorts of musical contexts, people stand up. Not only when they're singing, and this of course would be the posture of bodies and choirs, or churches that do a kind of liturgy or worship service where they sing together, but also at concerts. Why would people not want to be sitting down, or why would they leap to their feet and stay standing or moving throughout the sets of, if you will, a rock concert or a heavy metal concert? All right? You can take that and think about it, right? I mean, one could, again, then, with the help of the scientists, talk about all sorts of things that are going on vestibularly and otherwise. But the fact is, it fires us up. All right. It has this affect. But also, we have to recognize that this was a great change that came about in worship in what we can call, historically, Western Christianity, to install permanent seating in church buildings. It's never taken place in, again to use this language, Eastern or Orthodox churches, largely. It has in the American context, the U.S. context, but largely not. Not even in all the Orthodox churches. In full disclosure, my mother was Orthodox, my grandparents, a whole half of my family. Some seating would be there for the frail or the elderly or a mother holding a child. But I learned early on I better wear comfortable shoes because I'd be so embarrassed. I'd have my grandmother, who was, in her 70s, saying, you can have a seat for a while, because my feet are killing me. It's like, no, if you're standing the whole time, the hell I'm going to sit down. So my point is, a change in worship in the West certainly came in many ways, multiple ways, but one of the ways, in the Reformation, the printing press, the change of a worship that, such that if you look down at, and James White, the great Methodist liturgical historian and theologian, taught me this. In his books, if you look down, you would see that a church now on its floor plan looks much more like a page of a book. It's a white surface with dark lines, the tops of the pews varnished dark, all in a row facing a title or a direction of the pulpit. Now, I'm not saying any of this to deride any of it. It's with people like James White that I learned so much from, that we start to analyze what's going on in spaces of worship. So what I'm trying to describe is how a much more instructional form of worship, with very lengthy sermons, or perhaps homilies, a very changed environment in terms of posture came about. And it certainly continued even in, of course, in Catholicism, although for many of the older churches throughout Europe, you'll find they don't have pews, but they have chairs, chairs that can be moved or moved around. That changes bodies at worship, right? And when and how standing versus sitting. How could one pray notice these differences. How could one, as I find at least in the experience of Roman Catholicism, how could one pray together sitting down? And yet, the bodily posture of standing to sing in Roman Catholicism, which, as it's only evolved in my lifetime since the 1960s, often can be one in which people are sitting while they're singing. And yet if one goes and experiences Protestant worship across a range of ethnicities and church traditions and bodies, it would be unthinkable to sing sitting down, but one might pray sitting down. Again, I hope you hear this as descriptive work, right? This is not at all about drawing a judgment. But these are good questions to consider when one's analyzing and trying to advance or, understand what's going on in bodies of worship. So choirs, the other thing about, I've moved into really the notion of the acoustical space, right? That bodies are positioned in relation to each other. And in these last 5 minutes, I'd just like to speak to the obvious about acoustics. And the thing from scientific research that we know is that all sounds that are made have not only what we call tones, but they all have a whole range of overtones and undertones. Put simply, to try to grab this quickly, this is why all the instruments in an orchestra that are all playing the same note sound that note differently, right? Why a cello sounds different than a viola, than a violin, than a bass. To shortcut to that, it's got to do with the whole range of over and undertones around the tone that we call the note. That Nashville Symphony, they're brilliant, right? They're tops. So they hit that note perfectly, we'd say, right? And yet you have this range. Well, that's what's going on also in the entire auditory space in which worship takes place, as well as in our bodies themselves. And if you remember what I said about Tomatis, he's saying also that's why, in his work he found, people singing, actually it has a greater holistic health effect than only hearing music. Because our own bodies are doing that in a range. Yeah. Okay. So acoustics matter greatly. Music, like all symbols, aren't just merely that. In fact, they're integrally, you see. I'm fighting any dualistic notions, as if music is an add-on. Problem in Catholicism, not in so many other churches. But now, I go fight my own fights in my own house. So sound has all these tones and overtones, but the space in which sound takes place, of course, affects this, right? And so the Nashville Symphony benefactors and so forth build a concert hall where they try to really replicate and learn from the best acoustics for such halls to produce the one that they did. In American society, so often, certainly in my world of U.S. Catholicism, the construction has never much taken that into consideration in the last half century or more. The thing has been much more about sight lines and accommodation and not about sound. And so, to give you just some pithy examples, among the Association of National Pastoral Musicians, a large group, had a fun time at one point with buttons and bumper stickers saying, "Carpet bedrooms, not churches." So you have social and cultural bodies who feel like this is a more welcome or homely space if it's carpeted, but you have musicians fighting back saying, but this destroys good acoustics for this total sonic effect. To give a bow way back in history, there's a whole branch of study that's taken place that could be called the study of sacred architecture. But what this is regarding, for example, is the genius of some of the monuments of Gothic churches and cathedrals, where in fact those architects were taking into account how sound resonates right in the vaults, and the overtones that come back in resonance. Myself as an organist, and the instrument I trained on when I was getting those credits at the Boston Conservatory, was in a room that had a resonant time between 4.5 and 5 seconds. That's a long time, right? But it was a room that in fact the ceiling was replaced in this vault that's 5 stories high for the instrument that was built in the 80s for Bach's 300th birthday. But it was all done so that it was a room that was better suited to the sound of the organ and the sound of the voice. So I'm just giving you these as some examples. as I watch my time now, as you see, I work from an outline because if I read you a text, it would have bored the hell out of you because I get too heady. Oh, that was recorded. I apologize for the vulgarity. But it does raise questions, and it may for you, whether or not and how amplification helps or hurts, right? And then just a final word. I'll have to do it quickly. If we have questions, we can raise them about silence. Musicians know that music only happens if we breathe. Ritualists know ritual only happens, metaphorically speaking, if we breathe, but not only metaphorically, but also physically. And so it's interesting to compare how silence does or is not integral to a given assembled body's worshiping practices. And I would venture, it's only a venture, it's a thought, okay? Thank you for letting me try it out, and especially ending on such a, watch out for the pun, such a note. But it may be that people, depending on what's going on in their social historical location, in our own time now, in churches in the United States, that there's more space for silence in some churches than others because the mission, the need, and what's salvific in those churches is exactly situated different socially. If a group of people who are oppressed or living out a history of oppression need to find that they're not silenced or isolated, it wouldn't surprise me that their worship service is one that doesn't have so much silence, because what's in fact empowering is the unification sonically of the bodies. But if that was too elusive, forgive me. If you wonder, we could ask. But from the other side, you have the experience of silence for people that should be explored, I think, in an overwhelmingly, if you will, use the pejoratives, media-saturated environment. And so the question of silence is a question of sound. The question of silence is a question of music, is a question of worship, because worship only happens if bodies are doing it. Okay, thanks. Let me take a few minutes. Went a little bit longer than I thought I would. I was going to try to stop it to leave 15, but we've got a good 10 minutes. Questions or comments or thoughts that arise? Or things that I ran through too quickly?
I have a question. My own ignorance. What does vestibular mean?
It's simply the term that refers to the function of the middle and the inner ear in relation to verticality of the body. So that it's basically got to do with the systems in the body governed by the ear. So it's the entire physiology of that in the body, both how that works and how it malfunctions and how it's treated. But that adjective, vestibular, is referring to that bodily phenomenon. Is that okay? Yeah, Steve.
So you mentioned the eye body.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about like how the body has, saying that I have a body is in itself expressing its own duality.
Mm-hmm.
So you have I and then you have a body. And that I hyphen body might be a better way to think about that. So I was just curious how that relates to Buber's thoughts on I thou. I just felt like there were some connections there. I didn't know if there are in those trains of thought, or if that's just a connection I'm making myself.
On a first bounce, I'd have to go look in the footnotes at that point in Chauvet's text to see if that were the case. I don't recall it, though. So then what can happen well is for you to generously, no good deed goes unpunished, insofar as you kindly spoke up. What's your initial thought on that?
So my initial thought is that if we're talking about a deconstruction of power dynamics within modern reality, we have to get into those conceptual understandings and dualities and separations of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So like when you're bringing up I body as one thing, that's another step in the right direction for me of reconstructing or deconstructing these false dualities and dichotomies that seem to plague us.
Yeah, I would agree. Dave, did you want to add anything to that? Because you were nodding.
Well, so a related theme to Buber's I and Thou, and that, obviously well as a classic theme of systematic theology, but that I saw implicit at several points in your talk is the creature-creator distinction. You know, for example, when you're criticizing a certain sort of Gnostic duality to separating the I and the body, that's maybe an attempt to usurp the place of the creator. You know, to be disembodied would be to confuse oneself as the creator rather than the creature. But then I also heard it in, you know, Basil's comments on standing are all, and generally a pre-modern Christian view of worship is the creature's response to the creator. So I don't know, I heard that theme implicit at several points. I don't know if that's something you'd want to reflect on or if it fits with your thesis.
I think it does. I think rather than my reflecting on it further, it's just a beautiful suggestion that I'm hoping all of us in the room, people will take different things, but they could pursue. The one thing I'd say with gratitude to both your comments, the I-thou relationship for Buber, right, also was going against the grain of much more of a subject-object philosophy, right, that was by then current in continental academic circles. And a key thing then for what Chauvet's doing with the person body or the I body is also trying to recognize the interpersonal nature of human sociality. And so all of that has to be taken account of. That's just to add something out of what you said. But the way in which, I mean, just to state the obvious, and I don't want to use up too much time because there may be other questions or comments, but is the value in sticking with the clumsy I-body or person-body can help people at least clarify in conversation, either for themselves or in conversations or even contestation, arguments, what again is being assumed as natural or given. Because we only are as we are actually functioning, right? And we only exist, remember I said about Chauvet, the corollary of this is we only, as humans, we completely exist symbolically. So that symbol and reality, which is a strange problem in Western civilization from roughly the early 9th century forward, has no parallel on the rest of the planet. It may be being inflicted through globalization now and the hegemony of the so-called West. But what I'm trying to say is that we've suffered, I think, in all different quarters from this notion that things are merely symbolic versus real, when in fact the only way we deal, even if we think of the scientific as the real, the measurable data, it's only communicated symbolically. So if that helps, anyway, I'm just trying to build. If you ask me what was my thought, that's the further thought, and then, all right, shut up. Other questions or comments as I watch the couple of minutes? Yeah, please, Donna.
Could you reflect on the differences between speech and song? And in particular, I'm remembering a riveting moment in my training as a neurology resident when I took my esteemed attending to see an elderly man who had become nonverbal and was very frustrated by his inability to speak. And when my attending began to sing with him, they had a beautiful conversation in song that moved all of us to tears. This man who couldn't speak.
Right. Well, I mean, a comment or two, but the story itself, I just want to thank you for it, right? But what we do find, I mean, I would assume, but you know, you are a professional in this neurology, but certainly one of the things going on seems to be the effect that song has on the intellect. You know, though I stumble because I'm just an amateur, of the mystery of the brain itself, right, the complexity of the brain. But people memorize better, right, by singing. In fact, in oral cultures, non-written cultures, the key way that you get people to learn and carry on traditions is musically. So I don't know the science of this and what's been published on this. I'm a hack on it. But I'm saying clearly there's a real affect, through music itself. Now, this other question is about memories, right? And how memory, which is just they're working like crazy on it, right? But I know from my own mom, who had Alzheimer's, toward the end of her life, very often the one thing she could join in when she was no longer able to construct sentences, was then to sing songs. And then she knew the words. So, kind of parallel to your, yeah. Okay, well, Dave, I'm looking at my clock, like one more or so, because I'm sorry, yeah. Well, two. You have two hands, we'll do two. Yes, please.
I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this oppositionality of the traditional corporality versus the I-body.
Yeah.
Especially in relationship to kind of what we're seeing today is how we're excising certain populations in our country prematurely, in my opinion, because you start getting groups who aren't ready to give up that cultural memory. So I guess my question is how, and even if we can tie in the metaphor of music and the phenomena of music, how can we embrace some of these cultural memories that some of us are ready to move past, but others may not be?
Yeah, and I think one of the key questions is, of course, why in the what's going on. Why would one want to move past them? So one's having to analyze what's going on in the social body such that something else has greater authority or power, right? So political theologians will move us very quickly to say the two dominant forms of reason or rationale for what we're doing are the market and the techno-scientific or the technological. And that opens up a whole complex set of questions about how do, I would just call it pockets of resistance. How do people actually perdure in making those traditions persist, recognizing, as from my Yupik example 40 minutes ago, that there inevitably are going to also be adjustments therein, right? And that's the, I think that's the challenge. But I see in your generation, making assumptions about your age, and others, you know, a certain interest among some people, younger people, to want to preserve a lot of these practices. But it's a small phenomenon. There are larger forces. And that then raises further the question of worship in churches, because this is Christian theology I'm doing. Worship in churches, to what extent is it cultural and countercultural, right? And that's a current moment we're living in, that question. Finally, Joy?
My question is, it's not so much a question as I'm asking your thoughts.
Okay, comment.
In regards to how ritual exists in part to help us live and function in the world, and then talking about vibrational patterns, what that means when there's so much literal and metaphorical noise in the world.
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, that is a second example, these last two comments or questions, about how we are changing humanly at this time in the 21st century. Yeah, I mean, those are the sorts of questions to be explored, you know. And Jeremiads, as it were, against, you know, these phenomena aren't going to get much traction, right? To just start railing into the wind against these realities is, I do think, is just shouting into the wind. But it does, we already see now, don't we? I hear it on NPR and, you know, other places, reports and stories about people trying to start turning off their technology for a given period in the evening, that kind of stuff. So I think there's going to be an ongoing recognition for the need for that. Finally, even an article that caught my eye, again as an amateur, but, well, you know, in the science section of the New York Times, I do believe is where I read it back in the fall, but finding the effects not only of being out walking or hiking without any earbuds and all that kind of stuff, but some study now on the physiological effect on the whole body of being under the canopy of trees. So in other words, there's a whole way in which, sadly, the bitter joke is on us if we don't recognize the natural body in effect to the relational, the traditional and the social. And I know, myself included, there's a faculty meeting, so in respect to your time and to say thanks, time to quit. Thank you.